Can one Bible story fix your fatigue? That sounds crazy, right? Impossible. But here's the thing. If you're the kind of person who regularly has concerns or worries about whether you're doing everything good enough or right enough, if you're the kind of person who's convinced that God has asked you to be perfect, and so you put a great deal of time and effort into being perfect and doing things exactly right, I would highly recommend that you consider the lessons we can learn from the life story of Abraham. Hi, I'm Stephen Berg with ChristianFatigueSolutions.com. If worries and doubts about whether you are doing things right enough or whether you're being good enough are a constant pattern for you, then it is very likely that your brain and body is being put into a state of alarm, the flight, or freeze reflex, to be specific. If you live in that state enough, your body can respond as if you're living in a war zone or being threatened by wild animals on a regular basis. In the long run, it can drain your energy and actually start degrading or destroying your body at a cellular level and definitely contribute significantly to your fatigue. But you might be asking the question, what's that got to do with Abraham? Well, I'm glad you asked. You see, Abraham had one big, giant defining characteristic: faith. He was a man of very strong and seemingly perfect faith. You can see that right in nearly the very first mention of him in the Bible. Here in Genesis chapter 12, verse 1, the Lord said to Abraham, "Leave your land, your relatives, and your father's home. Go to the land that I will show you." God is literally asking him to leave the place he knows, the people he knows, and to go someplace he doesn't know where it's at. And God's asking him to get started without God ever telling him where he's actually going to go. Doesn't that sound kind of crazy? Wouldn't that be hard for you to do? It sure would be for me. But Abraham acted on it. Abraham engaged his faith and took God up on his offer. But of course, there's more. If we look in Hebrews chapter 11, we'll see all kinds of things that Abraham did by faith. By faith, Abraham, when called to go to a place he would later receive as his inheritance, obeyed and went, even though he did not know where he was going. By faith, he made his home in the promised land like a stranger in a foreign country. He lived in tents, as did Isaac and Jacob, who were heirs with him of the same promise. For he was looking forward to the city with foundations, whose architect and builder was God. Further on, by faith, even Sarai, that's Abraham's wife, who was past childbearing age, was enabled to bear children because she considered him faithful who had made the promise. And so from this one man, even though he was as good as dead, came descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as countless as the sand on the seashore. But Abraham's faith is tested in even deeper ways, as we find later on in Hebrews chapter 11. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He, Abraham, who had embraced the promises, was about to sacrifice his one and only promised son. Yes, Abraham had other biological children, but only Isaac was the one that God had promised would carry forward his descendants that would be listed as numerous as the stars of the sky or the sands on the seashore. So it was only Isaac that was carrying forward that promise. Even though God had said to him, "It is through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned," Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead. And so, in a manner of speaking, he did receive Isaac back from death. Abraham was actually willing to sacrifice the one child that God had said was going to be the seed that was going to carry that promise forward and result in God's promise being fulfilled. How's that possible when this is the child that's supposed to generate all the other people, all your descendants? But Abraham had strong enough faith to figure out, well, God keeps making this promise to me over and over again. This child was a miracle, born in my old age and my wife's old age, way after we could have children. If necessary, God could raise him from the dead, if that's what it takes. So Abraham went ahead and made the most incredible choice anybody could possibly make. But that's not all there is about Abraham. If we go back to Genesis, we can see how God looked at Abraham. Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. Abraham's faith, Abraham's trust was credited by God as righteousness. Abraham was counted as right. And skipping down to chapter 17, verse 1, and when Abraham was 90 years old and 9, the Lord appeared to Abraham and said unto him, I am the Almighty God. Walk before me and be thou perfect. So here's the thing. If we understand the story of Abraham as being an example for us to show us how to live and how we're supposed to live our lives, that creates an incredibly high standard. And while that may be very intimidating, even Christ himself directly states in Matthew 5:48, be perfect, therefore, as your Father in heaven is perfect. So is that our fate? Are we doomed to constantly struggle to reach a goal we can never attain? To reach a standard that's impossible for us to reach? If we see ourselves with any accuracy at all, we realize we fail on a regular basis. But is that all there is? Or is there something more to this story? If we read further on in Genesis chapter 12, we discover that the land where he was traveling in had a big famine. And so Abraham decided to move into the land of Egypt to try and avoid the famine. And here's how the Bible in Genesis chapter 12 describes Abraham in more detail in his trip into Egypt. As he was about to enter Egypt, he said to his wife Sarai, I know what a beautiful woman you are. When the Egyptians see you, they will say, this is his wife, and then they will kill me, but they will let you live. Say you are my sister, so that I will be treated well for your sake, and my life will be spared because of you. Huh? Let me see if I get this right. Abraham, this amazing great man of faith, is leaving Canaan, where he's been traveling around because there's a famine, and he goes back into Egypt, and he's thinking to himself, I got this super smoking hot wife, and the Egyptians are going to take her, and they're going to kill me because they know that I'm her husband. So let's make up a story, and that story will be, you're my sister and not my wife. Does that sound like a guy with really great, strong faith who's trusting God to take care of him? Not so much. But let's read further and see what else we can discover. If we move on to Genesis chapter 15, we discover the fourth time that God reiterates his promise to Abraham. And this is the reaction. But Abram said, Sovereign Lord, what can you give me since I remain childless, and the one who will inherit my estate is Eliezer of Damascus. That was his servant, by the way, his chief servant, manager, so to speak. And Abram said, You have given me no children, so a servant in my household will be my heir. This great man of faith, whom God has repeated this promise to 4 times, is starting to wonder, starting to doubt. And in fact, he's assuming that his servant, his general manager, is actually going to inherit his estate rather than this promised son that, well, hasn't arrived. Continuing on, then the word of the Lord came to him. This man will not be your heir, but a son who is your own flesh and blood will be your heir. He took him outside and said, Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. Then he said to him, So shall your offspring be. But then in verse 6 it says, Abram believed the Lord, and he credited to him as righteousness. So Abraham doubts God after 4 promises, and he's assuming that his servant Eliezer is going to be the inheritor of his estate. And God, after finishing his 4th rendition of his promise, convinces Abraham enough to believe him, and that's counted as righteousness. Does that sound like perfection to you? That actually sounds a lot more like me. It sounds an awful lot like another story where a man brought his child to Jesus and asked Jesus to heal him. And Jesus asked him, "Do you have faith? All things are possible for people that have faith." And the father answered in the most amazing way, "I have faith. Help thou my unbelief. I believe. Help thou my unbelief." He fully acknowledged the reality of the situation. He had faith, a little bit of trust, but he knew he should have more. And he simply told God the truth. He's told Jesus the truth. "I believe a little bit. Please help me to believe more." And that's kind of what Abraham's looking like here. God tells him 4 different times. After 3.5 times, Abraham's pretty much doubting and thinking Eliezer is going to show up and end up being his heir. And God says, nope, that's not going to happen. And that's just enough to push Abraham over to, "I'm going to believe you, Lord." And that was credited to him as righteousness. But let's see if we can learn more from the story of Abraham. If you read through Genesis chapter 16, you'll discover the story of Hagar. Hagar was actually Sarai's wife's servant. In other words, Sarah's servant. And after years of these promises being repeated by God about this child that Abraham's supposed to have and, well, no children, Sarai decides that she's going to help Abraham take things into their own hands and help God out. And she suggests, well, why don't we have my servant girl, Hagar, sleep with you, and then her child could be credited as my child, and then you'll have an heir. Well, at that time period, it sounded like a pretty good plan. I know in modern times it's probably not going to fly, but it seemed like a reasonable plan to them. So in fact, that's what happened. Hagar slept with Abraham. Abraham got her pregnant. She had a son. Her son's name was Ishmael. But wait a minute. Wasn't Abraham supposed to have a son by his wife, not his wife's servant? Was there any place in God's promises that said his heir would be a half-child credited to his wife? Nope. No place in the Bible does it say that. Again, this was another misstep by Abraham, of course assisted by his wife in this case. He was trying to fulfill God's promise, doing it his way. And if we read further on in the next chapter, we have another example. This time it's the 5th promise that God makes to Abraham. And God also changes his name and the name of his wife to indicate how serious God is about this promise that he's going to have all these descendants. But here's what happens. Immediately Abraham bowed down with his face touching the ground. He laughed as he thought to himself, "Can a son be born to a 100-year-old man? Can Sarai, a 90-year-old woman, have a child?" Then Abraham said to God, "Why not let Ishmael be my heir?" Here's God repeating his promise for a 5th time. Abraham's response? He's laughing to himself. He's going, "Well, thank you, God. That's really great. I am so happy you have these wonderful intentions for me, but I'm 99 years old. Hey, things probably ain't working too well. And Sarai, she's 90. You remember the last time she had a period? Well, I don't know. I'm not sure if she knows. This isn't going to happen. So I tell you what, why don't we let Ishmael be counted as my son? The one from the servant girl Hagar? He is my son. He's not my wife's son exactly, but let him be counted as my heir." However, strangely, even though Abraham laughed, and even though he was clearly doubting God, he actually also believed God. You see, further on in that chapter, God gives him the covenant of circumcision and says that every male in their entire family, all the people with them, not just blood relatives, had to be circumcised. So Abraham had himself and Ishmael and all the rest of his family circumcised. So what you really have is a man who looks at the reality as he knows it and doubts God because the reality doesn't match with God's promises, But at the same time, he's wanting to trust God. He's trying to trust God. And when God gives him a specific action to do, he follows through on it. Now that sounds a bit more like me and maybe a bit more like you. You want to do the right thing. You're trying to do the right thing. You're intending to trust God. And you do sometimes, most of the time, part of the time, but not all the time. And that's Abraham. But let's continue with the story. Later on, Abraham moved to the Negev and settled between Kadesh and Shur. While he was living in Gerar, Abraham told everyone that his wife Sarai was his sister. Yep, this is the second time he did that. So King Abimelech of Gerar sent men to take Sarai. God came to Abimelech in a dream one night and said to him, "You're going to die because of the woman that you've taken. She's a married woman." Abimelech hadn't come near her, so he asked the Lord, "Lord, will you destroy a nation even if it's innocent? Didn't he tell me himself, 'She's my sister'? And didn't she even say, 'He's my brother'? I did this all innocently and with a clear conscience." After his encounter with God, Abimelech was very scared. And so he brings Abraham in and basically asks him, "Why on earth did you do this? Why did you lie to me? Why did you set me up to act like I was doing something wrong in front of your God?" And here's Abraham's response. Abraham said, "I thought that because there were no God-fearing people in this place, I'd be killed because of my wife. Besides, she's my sister." Was that really the point? "My father's daughter, but not my mother's. She is also my wife. When God had me leave my father's home and travel around, I said to her, 'Do me a favor, wherever we go, say that I'm your brother.'" As we move further along in Abraham's story, we come to chapter 21, and finally Isaac is born. This promised child that God has repeated the promise to Abraham at least 5 different times is finally born, the child of promise. But Abraham's tests of faith are not over yet. In Genesis 22, we read, "Later God tested Abraham and called to him, 'Abraham.' 'Yes, here I am,' he answered. God said, 'Take your son, your only son Isaac,'" the only son of promise, "'whom you love, and go to Moriah, sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains that I will show you.'" So Abraham is being asked by God to kill, to sacrifice the one child who is supposed to be carrying forward this gigantic promise that God has repeated to him many, many times. Can you imagine being on that journey, taking your son with the servants and the donkeys and leaving his mom at home and going to this place and knowing what you're going to do, but not being able to tell anyone? Do you think Abraham got any sleep that night? I sure wouldn't have. But by now, Abraham has been through experience after experience of God coming through for him, despite his imperfect faith. And through each one of those experiences where God has met him, where God has protected him, where God has blessed him, Abraham's faith has grown a bit more. Now, mind you, God even blessed Abraham even in the middle of his mistakes. Those 2 times he told the kings that his wife was his sister, the Pharaoh and then Abimelech, both times God did supernatural miracles to stop those kings from ever touching Sarai, even though they believed that she was his sister and they had every reasonable right, according to their customs, to take her as a wife. And in fact, even though Abraham was demonstrating a lack of faith and lying to these people, God actually protected him and protected his wife. Abraham saw those things. He experienced those ways in which God blessed him and protected him. And through all that, his faith grew. And so now we reach the point where he has the ultimate test. Abraham is determined to trust God and follow through on God's request. And so he goes up to the mountain, taking his son with him, and this is what ends up happening. Next, as Abraham picked up the knife, took it into his hand to sacrifice his son. He was already in the act of going to sacrifice his son. The messenger of the Lord called him from heaven and said, "Abraham!" "Abraham!" "Yes," he answered. "Do not lay a hand on the boy," he said. "Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you did not refuse to give me your son, your only son." Such a huge, massive test, but Abraham passes. That's why he's credited as a man of righteousness. Not because he was perfect, not because he had perfect faith all the time under all circumstances. If you look at the details of his life, he actually had quite imperfect faith. Probably a lot more like me or perhaps you. He was counted as righteous. He was counted as perfect because he had the general intention to follow God. Because he was allowing God to transform his heart, to transform his character. He was allowing God to install in him Christ's character of faith and trust. And that's really good news for you and me. You see, we don't have to be perfect. This urge, this need to do everything exactly right is unnecessary. This expectation that God wants us to be perfect in everything we do and in who we are and in every way is just simply wrong. God understands at a deep, deep level. We were born with a character imprinted by Satan. We don't have a choice in that. That is exactly the way we were born. And God isn't mad at us for that. It's like a child being born with AIDS. It's not the child's fault. He's just born with a disease. You got to take care of the disease or the child will die. The same is true for us. We are born with the disease of sin. God isn't mad at us because we have it, but he does need to change it. And so our goal as Christians isn't to be perfect. Our goal is to stay connected to Christ so he can transfuse his character into our hearts and minds, and therefore, as his character lives in us and through us, we will become increasingly more perfect. But as we stumble along, making mistakes, God credits our efforts, our imperfect efforts, as righteousness. So let go of the pressure of perfectionism. It's impossible and unnecessary. Relax in God's demonstrated willingness to make perfect results out of imperfect efforts. When you release the anxiety-triggering pressure of always trying to be perfect, it allows your body to relax out of this flight or flight state. And all that energy that's been put into the anxiety of trying to do everything perfectly and wondering if you're good enough or whether you did it good enough can then be used as energy to live. Your body then will be able to be in a calmer state, in the ability to increase the ability to heal and stay in a healthy state so that you then have more energy. And that is how one biblical life story might be a big part of the solution for your fatigue problem. But now it's your turn. Share in the comments what's worked for you in helping you let go of this need to do everything right and to be perfect. Share what's been successful for you. Share what hasn't worked. P.S. If you watched this far, I've got an interesting little experiment for you, just to demonstrate how imperfection is good enough. If you watched this far in the video, I'm pretty sure you must have gotten something that's valuable and useful to you. So what I would like you to do to demonstrate that imperfect is good enough, go back, rewatch this video, and count how many times I make mistakes in what I say or how I say it or how I quote something. I'd like to know how many mistakes there were. And if you still got something useful out of it, that demonstrates concretely that even though I didn't do this video perfectly, even after editing it, yep, I took out a whole bunch of the really big mistakes, it still produced something that was useful and meaningful to you. And by the way, I'd like you to share that with more people. So could you please share this video with others? It helps the algorithm in YouTube and Facebook to know this is something that other people could really benefit from. Thanks a lot. Have a blessed day.